So this is the second session of the first module, and we're focusing on the dichotomies. Now, we just talked about introversion and extroversion, the actual distilled difference between the two, why most people think they know what introversion and extroversion is, and how they're kind of close but not exactly spot on because they're looking at the behaviors. What's interesting about this next dichotomy that we'll be talking about, and remember again that dichotomy means a pairing of opposites, and nothing in reality, nothing in nature is an actual true pairing of opposites, so we're always going to be talking about things that have a little influence on each other. However, the easiest way to understand these dichotomies is to separate them and look at them just all on their own, and that's what we're going to do with all four of them. And in this pairing of opposites of sensing and intuition, this is one that most people don't have on their radar at all. They don't understand this even in the tiniest little bit of the social consciousness or awareness. This is something that is a lot more of an inner game process, or it's a lot more internal. And so it's not really observable in the outside world except in all of course, the emergent behaviors. And so unlike introversion and extroversion, where a lot of people kind of have to unlearn what they think about that, right? Like the social butterfly versus the person who's shy and retiring. They sort of have to unlearn a little bit and then relearn what the actual difference is. Most people come in not knowing sensing and intuition at all. Like they don't have to unlearn anything because they don't know what we're talking about. So that's good and also bad. The reason why that's bad is this second dichotomy of sensing and intuition is probably the most influential on a person's personality type of all four of the dichotomies. This is something that is massively and profoundly important inside of a person. It has a much broader difference in the population than introversion and extroversion. Introversion and extroversion is about a 50-50 split. So if you're an introvert, you're going to run into plenty of introverts. And if you're an extrovert, you're going to run into plenty of extroverts. However, the second dichotomy of sensing and intuition actually has a stratification of a 25-75% split. So there's actually a much bigger stratification between the people who have these two dichotomies than any of the other dichotomies. Because it's internal, it can only really be well, all of the processes are internal, so we're obviously only understanding them through emergent behaviors. And yet with this one, it's a lot more difficult because it really impacts how somebody understands reality. Now, this second dichotomy of sensing and intuition, and we'll really go into this massively granular later, but the second dichotomy of sensing and intuition is the foundation for the mental processes that help us learn new information. It's the foundation for how we understand reality. So if introversion and extroversion was the way that we engage with reality and find, which world is the real world and how we manage our energy, this dichotomy is about how we engage with all of that. All right. This is a very important dichotomy to truly wrap your mind around and understand. So I want to make sure that we go granular enough so that you can really understand the concept between these two styles. So again, these are learning styles. Sensing and intuition are learning styles. They're ways of processing information and understanding your world holistically. And whether you're a sensor or an intuitive indicates your favored method of perception. All right, so this is how you perceive reality. This is your way of interacting and perceiving reality. And the distilled difference between sensing and intuition is this. When understanding and learning new information, sensors, or people who favor their sensing process, rely on their five senses and more, all of their senses, to understand and perceive the world. Now, when I say five senses and more, there's more than just five senses. There's also a sense of, there's a sense of balance, there's senses of temperature. I mean, our bodies are extraordinary instruments of picking up pieces of information and data. And to a sensor, that's the instrument that they primarily want to be using to understand and perceive the world around them. They want to be using the instrument of what can be directly engaged with. The reason for this is because when they're learning new information, they want their information to be verifiable and reliable. That is their focus. Their focus when they're learning new information is what is verifiable, what is reliable. That is the most important component. And so what's more reliable and verifiable than what you directly engage with or what you directly interact with? So that's the most compelling piece of information to somebody of a sensory preference. An intuitive, on the other hand, doesn't just rely on their senses to give them information. They're actually relying on what can be called advanced pattern recognition, where sensors prefer verifiability and reliability, and that's what's comfortable to them, or that's what they're focused on when they're learning new information. An intuitive wants speed of information, and they want deep insight. They want to know what can't be known. They, by definition, want to understand things that can't be directly experienced. We have sometimes call the intuitive processes behind the curtains thinking. Behind the curtains thinking means that information behind the curtain can't be directly experienced. It is behind a curtain, right? Like, by definition, it can't be directly experienced. Whereas the sensor wants to know what's going on in front of the curtain because that is verifiable and reliable. To an intuitive, what's far more interesting is that thing beyond the curtain that can't be directly engaged with. And so intuitives become a lot more comfortable with speculation. Sensors want to directly engage with the world that they're learning new information about. Intuitives want to speculate on what could be going on in the world around them. So it's a very vital difference. It is a vital difference between how you're perceiving reality. Sensors are perceiving reality in a lot more of a concrete way. It's a lot more down to earth. It's a lot more about what is directly engaged with, or what at least can be, so-and-so got married. Oh, really? So-and-so got married? Okay, so I'm going to accept that information and find it interesting because I can get on the phone and call so-and-so and go, hey, did you get married? Right? An intuitive, on the other hand, is going to be a lot more interested in information that you can't call somebody about. Right? Like, you can't pick up the phone and go, hey, so, what's going on with that whole, I don't know, ancient aliens thing. And not that all intuitives are into ancient aliens, but that's a lot more likely to be something that is interesting if it's something that can't be verified, because then it needs to be figured out. So that alters the questions that sensors and intuitives are going to be asking. They're going to be asking, an intuitive is going to be asking a lot of what if questions, whereas a sensor is going to be asking a lot more what how questions, right? What do I know to be true? What can I directly engage with? How does it work? How does this thing that I'm directly engaging with work? Whereas an intuitive is more likely to ask questions like, what if? What are the possibilities? How could we do, I remember hearing a question a while back that I thought was such a brilliant intuitive question, which is, what would you do if you didn't have to start from here? Right, and that would be maddening to somebody who has a very strong sensory preference, because they would say, what do you mean I have to start from here? And the intuitive goes, yeah, but what if you didn't? And the sensor goes, yeah, but I do. And the intuitive goes, but what if you didn't? Right? And so it's those what if questions that really capture the imagination of intuitive. Now, because of that, because they are so much more comfortable with speculation, they begin to build a skill around speculation, just like a sensor begins to build skill around picking up information that is directly around them. All right, so what we focus our attention on, it's called the cost of specialization. What we choose to focus our attention on will be something that we gain skill in it because we're exercising it regularly, and it means the thing that we're not paying attention to is going to become more dwarfed in our talents, abilities, or skills. And so sensors have a tendency to get really perceptive of the world around them. They get really good at being in the moment. They get very good at understanding the world around them as it is, whereas an intuitive gets very good at pattern recognition, advanced pattern recognition. They get really good at speculating. They get to a point that when they make a speculation or a guess about how things are going to pan out, they have a high degree of accuracy because they've done that plenty of times in the past, and when they were wrong, they were able to refine the process. Now, what ends up happening between these two types, sensors and intuitives, is they have a tendency to just not understand where the other person is coming from. All right, they just can't get why the other person would be thinking in such a different way. And introverts and extroverts, there can be some fights that happen between them. There can be some, like, let's pretend you're married and you're an introvert and your mate's an extrovert, and they always want to go out and you want to stay in, and now you got fights about whether or not you should be staying out or going out or staying in. An intuitive and a sensor, though, when they fight, it's not even so much a fight as just like like you kind of put your hands up and go, I don't understand the world you occupy. I do not understand how reality works for you. And so it ends up being not so much a matter of fighting as it is just constant misunderstandings. All right, just perpetual misunderstandings. Now, because 75% of the population is sensory, that means that the world has a tendency to be defined by and designed for sensors. And if you look throughout history, we have, and this is not an official canonized piece of profiler training information or content, so please take this with a grain of salt. But my personal suspicion is that over time, as we evolved and our minds evolved to fit the context, we probably had a lot of sensors early on, and that was vitally important. Having sensors early on was vitally important for staying alive on the Serengeti. It was vitally important for building in a civilization and building infrastructure. It was vitally important in a lot of different ways. Whereas that intuitive part of us seems to have been the part that made our hairs stand up on the back of our head when we thought a predator was around. And there was a certain percentage of the population that started to pay attention to that little inner voice, that little pattern recognition inner voice that made their hair stand up on the back of their head. And so because they were paying attention to that voice, now intuition, which was a survival mechanism, seems to be something that became of interest and now spawned into things like early tribal shamans. They were most likely intuitives because they were trying to engage with, say, the gods or whatever divinity was happening around them. A lot of magic thinking was explained through intuitive, speculation or pattern recognition. Now, in early days, it wasn't very good, but that was the best technology they had at the time. However, over time, it feels like intuition became more and more of a focal point for a certain percentage of the population. And so then eventually intuition helps, say, guide technology and gets us to new technologies because it's asking questions about what if. Whereas the sensory process, it feels, has always been a profoundly important piece of keeping life going right here, right now. Intuitives are not as interested in the moment, and so they have a tendency to be a lot more into the projections of the future, whereas sensors are a lot more interested in what we have happening right now and what we have seen happening in the past. I just realized I didn't move my slide forward. So you guys could have been looking at all my notes. You could have been looking at my bullet points as I was talking. So just kind of scan that slide that I forgot to bring up. So look at the differences between sensors and intuitives. We've got the verifiable, reliable information, comfortable with using their five senses and then some. And then you've got intuitives, which like speed of information and depth of insight, and they become comfortable with speculation. So again, this totally changes how they're going to engage with and interact with the world around them. Now, some of the things that emerge from this is that sensors, because they like to engage with the world around them and have a sense of right here, right now, because they're more in touch with how their senses are, showing up for them, they have a tendency to seek contentment. All right, they want to feel contented. They want their senses to be pleased. They like a sense of homeostasis. They like a sense of, yeah, I'm here and now and everything feels good and we all are having a good time and things feel pleasurable. And that's not to say that all sensors are, ecstatically happy or just pleasure seekers. However, they like that feeling of contentment. They like that feeling of like knowing it's all handled. On the other hand, intuitives have a tendency to be restless. Having it all handled in the here and now is not nearly as interesting to them as, again, behind the curtain thinking. So they're always restless for the thing that they could be doing or that thing that could be happening right now. And this is a major difference between the two. If you end up using profiler training for coaching, I've used this in a lot of relationship coaching, and this can be a major aha for mates when one is a sensor and one is an intuitive. Whereas the intuitive feels like the sensor is just, again, seeking homeostasis and always just wants to be content. The sensor looks at the intuitive like they can never be happy, and there's nothing that will ever make them feel happy or content, when really this is just wiring. This is just deep down inside how we're wired to look at and perceive reality around us. Sensors crave enjoyment. They face life observantly, whereas intuitives have a tendency to crave inspiration and face life expectantly. They want to see what's coming up down the pike next. They're expectant. They're like, ooh, what's going to happen next? And in anticipation for the next phase. Whereas sensors have a tendency to be more talented at living in the moment. And obviously, more sensors are going to be more observant than intuitives regarding the outside world. They're going to be more observant, and this is going to be the cost of specialization for them. They'll do it at the cost of imagination. Imagination being the thing that intuitives use to speculate on what's going to happen next, because they have to imagine something in their head that doesn't currently exist, or at least we don't know how it exists. And so sensors will live life observantly at the cost of their imagination, whereas intuitives will be imaginative at the cost of observation. Intuitives are more likely to be sort of in that mind and projecting into the future, and their cost of specialization is that they're not as engaged with what's happening around them in real time. Both of them have good things and bad things that come with it. Sensors have a talent for recreating and living in the moment, and intuitives lack that ability to be present, and they're more future-oriented, so they lack that talent for recreating as much. However, they have more initiative and ambition for going to the next phase. So while they might not be as good at recreating in the moment, or they have to kind of like remind themselves to be present in the enjoyable times in the moment, they have a natural talent for going to the next phase or getting people motivated to get to the next space. Whereas a sensor will have more of a talent for living in the moment, but less of a talent for initiating change. Sensors are more safety oriented, and they're more risk averse. Now, we will talk about that there's two different styles of sensing and two different styles of intuition, and those two different styles actually change the flavor of the perception of the sensor, and the two different styles of intuition change the flavor of the perception of the intuitive, and you'll understand what I mean as soon as we get to cognitive functions. That said, even if a sensor is of the sensing style that's less physically risk averse, because there are some sensors that are they're very physically cavalier. You'll see them do incredibly dangerous things just for kicks, and they love it. They're risk averse, if not in a physical way, in an ideological way. So they have a tendency to seek ideologies that are tried and true, regardless of their flavor of sensing. Whereas an intuitive doesn't have that same risk aversion ideologically. They're a lot more open to the possibility that their ideology is wrong. Well, maybe not their ideology, but ideologies themselves can be questioned. It's more of sort of, if you've heard the expression, think outside the box and think about the box, intuitives are a lot more likely to think about the box itself and question whether or not, that's the right container to begin with. And so they're not as risk averse when it comes to ideology, whereas sensors have a tendency to be more risk averse when it comes to what they believe. And sensors have a more straightforward communication style. They are a lot more often to be straight shooters and a lot more concrete in how they communicate. Whereas intuitives will be less straightforward in their communication style. They'll be more symbolic. They have more analogies when they're talking, and they tend to be more abstract. Now, there's a certain percentage of intuitives that will say that they don't like abstractions. They'll say, oh, I hate abstractions. So I would recommend not using the word abstraction or abstract when engaging with an intuitive to try to figure out if they're intuitive, because there's a dirty word around the word abstract for some intuitives. That said, they really are more abstract. They really do like things that have a tendency to be less concrete. If you see abstraction and concrete mentality as, again, polar opposites, they have a tendency to go toward the abstract because it's simply more interesting to them, whereas sensors have a tendency to come down and be more concrete. Now, here's a caveat about intuition and sensing in the wild when you are doing passive profiling. One thing that you have to remember is that because sensors outnumber intuitives, they have and the world has created a world, the world or society has created a context that is more suitable to the sensor mentality because there's just more of them, so that makes sense. Because of this, intuitives oftentimes will not understand that they're not the only one who's different. They will feel different growing up, and they won't know that it's because of their wiring, which falls in a pattern of a certain percentage of the population feeling like they do. They'll think they're the only one. They won't say, oh, I'm like 25% of the population. They'll say, I'm an alien. I must have been, dropped off at the front door of my parents' house at birth, and I don't know anybody else who thinks like me. what ends up happening, and the reason why they don't know anybody else who thinks like them, or maybe just a couple people in their life, is because they end up having to speak a sensory style of communication. They end up having to be sort of ambidextrous or multilingual. And so they can pretend like they're sensory, they can play off like they're sensory, and they go into what we call hiding or blending. And so an intuitive might be an intuitive but have no idea that they have no idea that there are other intuitives out there, and there's no way that they'll ever let you know that they're intuitive. It's a protection for them. And so when you are figuring out what somebody's personality type, this can be something that really trips you up. When you see an intuitive and you're like, there's just something feels intuitive about that guy, or there's something feels intuitive about her, I'm not sure what it is. And yet everything else is screaming, or everything else is saying censor. Dig a little deeper and see if they're not an intuitive that actually has been blending for their own self-preservation purposes. You won't see this as often with sensors. It's, the world is designed for a more sensory component, so they don't really feel the need to blend or hide as much. All right. So a great question that we ask, and of course we're going to be talking about a lot of questions further on when we get to the actual, profiler or profiling portion after we get through the system. We'll be talking about a lot of these questions, but one question you can really ask a person in order to try to determine whether or not they're sensory or intuitive is, given that all people are unique, right? No two people are ever going to be the same. Do you feel fundamentally like you are like most people, or do you feel that you're very different and maybe even a little alien? Now, there are a couple of intuitives that don't like the word alien, just like they don't like the word abstract. So that might turn them off a little bit, and you might want to use a different word than alien. However, the question really is, do you feel like you're like most people, or do you feel like there's something fundamentally different about you? And most intuitives will say, I feel like there's something fundamentally different than me. And most sensors will say, no, I feel like I'm like most people. Now, there are some intuitives that will claim to feel like most people, and we'll talk about what those types are. And there are some sensors that will state that they feel different, and we'll talk about which types of sensors will identify with that, that I'm fundamentally different component. But as a rule, again, the bell curve, the vast majority of sensors will identify with being like most people, and most intuitives will identify with being fundamentally different. And that's one great way to be able to determine the two. All right, so before I launch into this portion of what we call the ladder of abstraction, which is a great way for understanding how to communicate with a person who's got a preference that is opposite of you, I just want to check in with the chat room. Is this making sense, this concept of sensors and intuitives? Are you really kind of getting the difference, or really feeling the difference between the two? Is this too abstract? Do you need more concrete examples, or are you getting this? Okay, great. Please don't be shy in the chat room, because this is getting it. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. Don't be shy. All right. Okay, so here's one way of really understanding the difference in how they think, and I'm going to present what we call the ladder of abstraction. Now, we've presented this in other places, so there are some really cool, like we have a webinar on YouTube that talks about the ladder of abstraction, or communications between sensors and intuitives, but I just kind of want to give you an overview of this, what we call the ladder of abstraction, quickly. It's actually a very interesting way of figuring out how to communicate with anybody. The ladder of abstraction says that when we are getting more abstract, we need to make sure that people are already on our same wavelength to be able to follow us all the way up that ladder. So let's pretend the more up the ladder we get, the more rungs we climb up the ladder of this ladder of abstraction, the more abstract we're getting. And the further down the ladder we go, the more rungs down we go, the more concrete we're getting. So an example, and we picked this up from a book called Language and Thought and Action by the writer's name is H.I. Hayakawa. And he was a person who grew up in the United States speaking English, but had Chinese immigrant parents who only spoke Chinese. And he was this professor. He ended up becoming a professor. He recognized that the the language that we are raised with, our first language, actually impacts our wiring as well. Okay, so just the language that we are raised with will alter how our minds are wired. And this is not a new thought. Alfred Korzybski, who was the grandfather of general semantics, talks about this. There's quite a few people who during that time period of Korzybski were really understanding how language very much impacts our wiring in our minds. That said, Hayakawa came up with this ladder of abstraction, which I think is really brilliant. So he said, let's start at the bottom with the most concrete example that we can find. Let's talk about Bessie the milk cow. Okay, so you're at a farm and you are referring to Bessie the milk cow. Now, is that concrete? Absolutely. There's one of Bessie. You can point to her. She's right there. That's Bessie. She's the milk cow. Okay, that's Bessie. There's only one of her, right? There's only one Bessie, and she's right there. That's an incredibly concrete example. And for the most part, sensors are more comfortable the more the specificity gets. The more concrete you get and the more specific you can get, a sensor is going to be the most attracted to conversation that gets really granular and concrete. That said, if you go up one rung up the ladder, all right, to the next rung up in abstraction, you can refer to cow. All right, so cow is a little more abstract. All right, there are cows around, right? You can point to the cows. They are still a concrete, tangible item, but they're not Bessie. There's not just one of them. It's not granular, super zoomed in, concrete. There's cows, right? And so it's kind of conceptual. It's a little conceptual, but we can still point to cows and see they have a concrete nature. Okay, so let's go up one rung and let's refer to farm animal. Now, Bessie the milk cow can be categorized as cow and can also be categorized as farm animal, but when you get to the rung that says farm animal, you're actually talking about things that are a little bit more abstract. So what's a farm animal? Well, is the cat a farm animal? The stray cat that comes and eats some of the pig's leftovers, is that a farm animal? A horse is a farm animal. Horse is not a cow. So we're getting a little bit more abstract here. So we're talking about a concept of farm animal, and you can still point to certain animals and go, yeah, that's a farm animal. But when we're talking about Bessie, if she was our primary topic, but now we're referring to her as a farm animal, we're getting a lot less concrete, specific, and tangible. All right, so let's go one rung up from farm animal to farm asset. All right, so farm asset is still even more abstract because now we could be talking about the tractor. We started out with Bessie the milk cow, and she is on some level of farm asset, but so is a tractor. So are we talking about animals anymore? What is an asset? And something could be both an asset and a liability, and it's contextual. And is this thing a liability right now, or is it an asset? And so now it's getting real conceptual. And the next rung up from farm asset is money. Now, a lot of times people will say money is concrete because they'll, pull out their billfold and show you a dollar bill, and they'll say, see, that's concrete. But the truth is that little green ticket, that little green piece of paper, that's very abstract and conceptual. I will give you a little green piece of paper, and you will give me goods and services in return, because we have a social contract that says that that's all okay. But if I pick up just any random green piece of paper, that doesn't mean I'm going to get those goods and services, because the abstraction or the concepts around this dollar bill is the important thing. It's the abstraction of money, not the actual dollar bill itself, that's important. And beyond that, most of us don't even carry cash anymore. It's more about the ones and zeros that are, behind the digital component of our bank accounts. Talk about abstract, right? It's not even dollar bills anymore. It's like, well, my bank account spits out a little piece of paper that tells me I have a certain amount of money in there. So money is massively abstract. Now, this is a ladder of abstraction. If you go all the way down, what were we talking about? We were talking about Bessie the milk cow. If I talked about farm asset, do you know I'm talking about Bessie the milk cow? Well, of course not, because I could be talking about 100 different things. If I'm talking about money, do you know that I'm referring to Bessie the milk cow? Well, of course not, because now we're talking about so many different components. So the ladder of abstraction is a great way of, it's a great metaphor for how we think in terms of increasing levels of abstraction. And intuitives have a tendency to be the most interested higher up the ladder. They are more interested in talking about the abstract concept of money than they are talking about Bessie the milk cow. Whereas a sensor is going to be a lot more interested in the concept of Bessie the milk cow, because that's that's tangible, that's verifiable, that's reliable information. And if you start talking about the abstraction that is money, a lot of sensors will just sort of tune you out because that's not as interesting. So this is a great way of understanding and illustrating the difference in how they think. And again, really mastering the difference between a sensor and intuitive mind frame is a big deal. You will understand this more and more as we talk about the different styles of sensing and intuiting. We'll really go granular, and you'll really understand how these cognitive functions, the wiring really works. But on just a really base level, getting this dichotomy down is a big piece of understanding a person's type. Okay, so let's talk about your exercise. So for those of you who are interested in the profiler training certification process, this is your exercise for getting in. And again, you're going to want to put your answer in the comment section of the members area. Okay, so find at least one video, whichever platform you choose to, find one video which illustrates a strong intuitive preference and one video which illustrates a strong sensory preference. And of course, explain why your videos are a good example of each preference. And also, this is not something you'll be turning in, but I recommend that everybody do it regardless of whether or not you're going for the certification process. Ask at least one person in your circle of friends or family the following question. And we're going to talk about that question that we referred to before, which is a great question for figuring out if somebody's sensory or intuitive. Given that all people are unique, do you feel fundamentally like you are like most people, or do you feel fundamentally different? If you choose to use the word alien, feel free. Sometimes that turns some people off. They go, well, I don't feel alien. But the important thing is to ask them, do they feel like they are fundamentally like most people, or are they fundamentally different than most people? And see what you get. Are the people who say that they feel fundamentally different, do you see all these other things coming up for them, that they are more abstract, they have a tendency to ask what-if questions? Really ask yourself that component. Whereas the ones who say, no, I feel like I'm like most people, do they more resemble the sensory way of going about life? Again, these are world views, and they are how people perceive reality. So it's very important to get this one component down. All right, so that's the sensing and intuitive dichotomy. Next time we're going to launch into the thinking and feeling dichotomy.